14 men rode into the Arkansas wilderness looking for one man. None of them came back alive. It was 1863. In 3 counties, plantation record books wrote down the same runaway slave's name. That name made experienced trackers say no to the job. It made bounty hunters ask for twice as much money. Chasing this man became like signing your own death sentence. For many years the story was hidden. Families were told their sons and fathers got lost during the war. But the real truth, hidden in courthouse basements and locked in private files, tells a completely different story. A record of careful, planned violence. Of a man who survived the impossible and killed so carefully that he destroyed every idea people had about what an escaped slave could do. Before we talk about the person they started calling the Reaper of Miller County, we must first understand the world that created him, the system that turned him into a weapon. Miller County, Arkansas, in the fall of 1862, sat on the edge of Confederate control. The Red River cut through its middle, feeding 60,000 acres divided among 43 plantations. Each one was its own small kingdom of cotton, wood, and human lives. The Hutchins Plantation, where this story begins, spread across 4,000 acres of rich farmland. Its dark black soil grew cotton so good it sold for high prices even when the war hurt Southern trade. The house itself stood on a small hill. It was 2 stories of white, painted cypress wood with 12 rooms and porches designed to catch any breeze that could break the summer heat. But the real heart of the Hutchins property wasn't in the big house. It was in the slave quarters. Unlike the neat rows of cabins on nearby plantations, Robert Hutchins had built a system. A compound arranged by skill, value, and obedience. 32 buildings held 214 enslaved people. The eastern area held the blacksmiths, carpenters, and leather workers. The western area held the field workers. And beyond them, fenced off from everyone else, stood a place the slaves whispered about but never said out loud. The punishment house. Robert Hutchins believed in organized correction. He had studied the writings of plantation management experts, wrote letters to owners throughout the South, and developed what he called calibrated discipline, a method that matched rule-breaking to specific punishments with scientific exactness. He kept detailed records of every punishment given, noting the tool used, the number of hits, and what happened after. These record books, kept in the Arkansas State Archives, show a mind obsessed with control, with turning human beings into numbers in an equation he believed he had perfected. Among the enslaved people, one man stood apart, not through any special treatment, but through a quietness that disturbed even the overseers who managed him. The plantation records list him only as Bass, bought in 1856 from a Tennessee dealer for $900, an incredibly high price that the record book explained with one note: unusual physical abilities and mechanical skills. A Bass stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with a body that showed not bulk but terrible efficiency. The kind of body that came not from easy living but from years of work that would have broken weaker men. He worked as a blacksmith and metalworker, skills that gave him access to tools, to metal, to the practical knowledge of how things were made, and more importantly, how they could be broken. The plantation's white blacksmith, a German immigrant named Otto Brenner, wrote in a letter to his brother that Bass had a mind for mechanics that is better than any craftsman I've known, no matter their background. He can look at a complicated lock or machine and understand how it works right away. It troubles me, though I cannot say why. What troubled Brenner was simple enough. Intelligence in a slave was dangerous, but intelligence combined with complete silence was terrifying. Bass only spoke, when directly asked a question, answered with the fewest words needed, and showed his owners a face that revealed nothing. The house slaves whispered that he had learned this in Tennessee, that his previous owner had tried to break him using methods that left scars across his back like a map of suffering. But if that suffering had broken something in Bass, it wasn't his will. It was whatever ability he might have had for mercy. He had been at Hutchins Plantation for 6 years when the war started. While other slaves whispered excitedly about Union armies and freedom, Bass stayed silent. While others were caught trying to escape and punished by Hutchins's calibrated discipline, Bass showed no desire to run. He fixed horses, repaired tools, made hinges and chains and shackles with hands that never shook and eyes that never met those of the white men who watched his work. Robert Hutchins believed he had found the perfect slave, talented, obedient, seemingly happy within the limits of his life. He had no idea he was looking at a man who had spent 6 years studying every inch of the plantation, memorizing patrol schedules, making lists of weapons, and preparing for a moment that would require perfect timing and complete ruthlessness. That moment came on November 3, 1862, when Hutchins made the mistake of taking Bass with him to the county seat. The trip to Texarkana should have been normal. A quarterly journey to handle legal business, buy supplies, and keep up the social connections that kept plantation society working. Hutchins brought Bass to handle the horses and help load heavy items. What Hutchins didn't know was that Bass had been waiting for exactly this chance, to be off the plantation in a town where multiple roads offered escape routes, where the chaos of wartime made unusual movements less suspicious. The day went normally until mid-afternoon when Hutchins stopped at the county courthouse to file paperwork about a property dispute. He left Bass with the wagon on the street, a decision that would have been unthinkable before the war, but had become common as white workers became scarce. The usual crowd of merchants, soldiers on leave, and farmers doing business filled the streets. No one paid special attention to one more slave standing by a wagon. What happened next unfolded so quickly that witnesses could barely piece together the order of events. Hutchins came out of the courthouse around 4 o'clock, papers in hand, talking about something with the county clerk. He walked toward the wagon, still talking, and reached for the driver's seat. Bass stood beside the wagon, head down, posture submissive. Then, in a movement that Otto Brenner would later recognize as similar to how Bass struck hot metal on an anvil, with perfect economy and devastating force, Bass picked up a bundle of iron chains from the wagon bed and swung them in a wide arc that caught Hutchins across the side of the head. The clerk's testimony, given under oath 3 days later, stated that Hutchins dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Bass didn't pause to check the results. He dropped the chains, grabbed a coil of rope and a burlap sack from the wagon, and jumped onto the driver's seat. Before anyone in the street could fully understand what they had witnessed, he had the horses moving at a run that quickly became a gallop, heading east on the road that led toward the deep timber country along the Sulphur River. The clerk ran into the street, shouting for help. People rushed to where Hutchins lay in the dust, blood pooling around his head. A doctor examined him and said he still lived, though barely. Someone fired a rifle shot, the traditional signal that a slave had run. Within minutes, the alarm had spread through Texarkana like fire through dry grass. By sunset, 18 men had gathered at the courthouse, a mix of plantation overseers, professional slave catchers, and opportunistic bounty hunters drawn by the $300 reward Hutchins's brother posted from his bedside, where he lay with a cracked skull and uncertain chances of survival. The group organized itself under the leadership of a man named William Taggart, a slave catcher with a reputation for never losing a fugitive. Taggart had spent 20 years chasing runaways through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. He owned 6 dogs, savage animals trained to track and hold targets, and carried a modified shotgun loaded with rocks designed to cause terrible pain without killing valuable property. But Taggart made a critical mistake in judgment that night. He thought of Bass as a typical fugitive, desperate, panicked, making decisions driven by fear rather than calculation. He divided his 18 men into 3 groups. 6 men would follow the road east. 6 would take a parallel route through the woods. The remaining 6, including Taggart himself, would circle north and position themselves to catch Bass when he inevitably tried to cross into Indian territory, where runaway slaves often looked for safety. It was a good strategy for chasing a frightened fugitive. Against Bass, it was suicide. The first body was found 48 hours after Bass disappeared. A farmer found it in a ditch 3 miles off the main road. A man named Douglas Patterson, one of the 6 who had taken the route through the woods. Patterson had been strangled with such force that his throat was crushed. His rifle, pistol, and knife were missing. More disturbing was how the body was positioned. Deliberately placed where it would be visible from a game trail, arranged with arms stretched out as if in warning. William Taggart's group found the body around noon on November 5th. Taggart examined the scene with the careful attention of a man whose survival depended on reading signs. What he saw troubled him enough that he sent 2 men back to Texarkana with a message asking for more help and bloodhounds. The remaining men in his group, himself and 3 others, pushed forward, following what Taggart believed was Bass's trail heading northeast. They made camp that night in a clearing beside a creek, keeping careful watch. The 3 men took turns standing guard while the others slept, rifles loaded and ready. Taggart woke at dawn to find one of his men missing. They found him 20 yards from camp, dead from what the later investigation would describe as manual strangulation with signs of struggle. His weapons were gone. So was his ammunition. That was when Taggart realized he wasn't chasing a fugitive. He was being hunted. The revelation came too late. Over the next 4 days, 11 more men died in the Arkansas wilderness. The second group of 6 following the road east was found scattered across 3 miles of territory. 3 had been strangled. 2 had died from what appeared to be blunt force trauma, killed by rocks or wooden clubs. One had drowned in 4 feet of water in a creek, held under with patient determination. Their weapons had vanished. Their ammunition pouches were empty. The pattern emerged slowly, pieced together by the county sheriff and a former army officer brought in to make sense of the massacre. Bass wasn't running. He was conducting a systematic campaign of elimination using tactics that suggested military training or natural strategic genius. He had studied his pursuers' methods, anticipated their movements, and turned their own strategies against them. The division into smaller groups, meant to cover more territory, had made them vulnerable. Bass picked them off one by one or in pairs, using darkness and terrain to his advantage. More disturbing were the details that came from examining the bodies and the kill sites. Bass had built deadfalls and snares along likely approach routes, traps that showed sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and trigger mechanisms. He had stolen horses from 2 of the groups, using them to move quickly between locations before releasing them to confuse his trail. Most unnervingly, he had apparently hidden himself close to his pursuers for long periods, watching their habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. William Taggart died on November 9th, found by a search party that had finally brought skilled trackers and enough men. 23 men with military experience and proper coordination. Taggart had been killed in his bedroll, strangled while his companions slept 15 feet away. The killer had entered and left the camp without alerting the guards or the dogs. The weapons taken from Taggart included a particularly fine rifle and 2 pistols, adding to an arsenal that Bass had been systematically collecting. The search party that found Taggart's body included a former Confederate officer named Captain James Hardesty, who had been called back from service specifically to lead the manhunt. Hardesty examined the scene with the eye of someone who had seen combat. His report to the county commissioners, kept in the Arkansas Historical Society files, includes this assessment. The fugitive shows tactical sophistication beyond that of most soldiers I've commanded. He shows patience, planning ability, and a willingness to take calculated risks. Most significantly, he shows no hesitation in killing, suggesting either complete emotional detachment or a level of rage that has burned away normal human limits. I believe we're dealing with someone who has decided his only options are victory or death, and has chosen to make his pursuers pay the highest possible price for his capture. By mid-November, Bass Reeves, for so the people had begun calling him, adding a surname that meant bailiff or steward, a bitter irony considering his systematic execution of those who represented law and order, had killed 14 men. The 300 reward had grown to 500, then 700, but professional slave catchers were refusing the job. Rumors spread through plantation communities. Some said Bass had military training from serving a previous owner who had been an officer. Others claimed he had learned tracking from Native Americans. A few whispered that he had made a deal with darker forces, that no natural man could move so silently or kill so efficiently. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Bass had spent 6 years in complete silence, watching and learning, converting every observation into practical knowledge. He had studied how patrols moved, how trackers worked, how men thought when they believed themselves superior. He had worked metal in a forge, learning about strength and breaking points, about leverage and force. And somewhere in those 6 years, he had made a decision that whatever happened after escape, whoever came after him would learn that treating a human being as property came with a cost measured in blood. The military eventually became involved, not officially, but through Confederate officers on leave who saw the manhunt as an opportunity to maintain discipline among the enslaved population. If one escaped slave could kill 14 pursuers with impunity, what message did that send to the hundreds of thousands still held in bondage throughout the South? Captain Hardesty was joined by 2 other officers, and together they assembled a force of 32 men. Former soldiers with combat experience, armed with military-grade weapons, and organized into a proper tactical formation. They spent 2 weeks searching the territory between the Red River and the Sulphur, using methods developed in warfare against Native American tribes, systematic sweeps, coordinated movements, and camp security that involved multiple guards and defensive positions. They found signs of Bass's presence, cold campfires, evidence of game being cleaned and cooked, tracks that suggested he was moving in a wide circle through the region. But the man himself remained invisible, a ghost who left traces but never appeared. The truth that Hardesty's journals reveal, documents donated to the Arkansas Military History Museum by his descendants, is that Bass was conducting a different kind of war. While the search parties scoured the wilderness, he was moving along the edge of civilization, approaching isolated farmsteads and small settlements under cover of darkness. He wasn't seeking confrontation, he was gathering information. On November 28th, Bass appeared at a small farm operated by a free black family named the Rayburns 10 miles south of the main search area. The family's account, recorded decades later, describes a man who emerged from the darkness carrying weapons that identified him as dangerous, but whose manner suggested control rather than desperation. He asked for food and information. The Rayburns, terrified but unwilling to turn away someone who might have been their son or brother in different circumstances, gave him cornbread and dried meat. During the meal, Bass spoke more words than he had apparently spoken in months. He asked about patrol routes, about which families might shelter a fugitive, about the location of the nearest Union Army units. The war was turning even in remote Arkansas. People knew that Union forces controlled key positions along the Mississippi. Freedom, if it could be found, lay to the east, beyond the reach of Confederate law. The Rayburns told Bass about a settlement of refugee slaves along the Arkansas, Louisiana border, a precarious community protected by Union gunboats on the river. They warned him the journey was over 100 miles through hostile territory, past dozens of plantations and military outposts. Bass listened, thanked them, and disappeared back into the darkness. But he didn't head east. Instead, he turned back toward Miller County, toward the territory where the search parties were concentrated. Hardesty's journals express confusion at this decision. Every tactical consideration suggested Bass should flee as quickly and as far as possible. Why would he return to the area of greatest danger? The answer became clear on December 3rd when the Hutchkins plantation was attacked. The assault happened around midnight when most of the plantation's population, enslaved and free, were sleeping. Bass approached from the east, moving through cotton fields that were chest-high and dry. He had apparently been watching the plantation for several nights, studying routines and security measures that had grown relaxed in his absence. The overseer, a man named Harold Vickers, maintained a night watch. 3 white men with rifles who patrolled the compound areas. Bass avoided them entirely, circling to the stables where the plantation's horses were kept. What followed was later pieced together from physical evidence and accounts from enslaved witnesses who saw portions of the events. Bass set fire to the stable using materials he had apparently prepared in advance: oil, soaked rags, and kindling position to create maximum flame spread. The fire caught quickly, spreading through the bone, dry wood structure and panicking the horses trapped inside. The night watch responded immediately, running toward the flames. So did others woken by the noise. Overseers, the plantation manager, even Robert Hutchkins himself, recovered from his head wound but still weak. In the chaos and darkness, with everyone's attention focused on the burning stable and the screaming horses, Bass moved through the plantation compound with clear specific purpose. He went to the punishment house. The structure had been locked from the outside, standard practice to prevent anyone inside from leaving until their sentence was complete. 2 people were being held there that night, accused of stealing food and awaiting morning discipline. Bass broke the lock with tools he had brought, opened the door, and spoke briefly to those inside. Then he moved to the overseer's quarters, a small building near the main house. Harold Vickers had run toward the stable fire like everyone else, but he had apparently realized something was wrong and doubled back. He encountered Bass in the darkness between buildings. What happened next was heard by multiple witnesses but seen by none. Sounds of struggle, a shout cut short, then silence. Vickers's body was found at dawn, strangled like Bass's previous victims. Beside him lay a branding iron, the same tool he had used countless times to mark runaways who had been recaptured. The iron had been placed across Vickers's chest, cold, but positioned with obvious symbolic intent. By the time the fire was put out and order restored, Bass had vanished. So had 6 enslaved people from the Hutchkins plantation, including the 2 he had freed from the punishment house. They disappeared into the darkness, following a man who had demonstrated that while escape was costly, the price could be paid in enemy blood rather than fugitive terror. The attack on Hutchkins plantation transformed Bass Reeves from a fugitive into something approaching myth. Throughout Miller County and beyond, the enslaved population whispered about the man who had killed those who hunted him, who had returned to free others, who moved through the landscape like smoke. The white population responded with increasing paranoia. Patrols doubled and tripled. Slave catchers demanded outrageous fees. Plantation owners slept with loaded weapons beside their beds. But the Confederate authorities faced a problem. The war was consuming men and resources. Every soldier dedicated to hunting one fugitive was a soldier not fighting Union forces. And Bass had now demonstrated that pursuit meant casualties. The 14 men he had killed represented a significant loss for a county that had already sent most of its able-bodied white men to military service. Captain Hardesty proposed a different approach. Rather than continuing active pursuit, his strategy involved establishing a perimeter and waiting. Bass had to eat, had to find shelter, had to eventually move toward Union lines if he truly wanted freedom. Hardesty positioned his forces at key river crossings and along major roads. He coordinated with neighboring counties, creating a network of checkpoints and patrols designed to catch Bass when he inevitably attempted to travel east. For 3 weeks in December, the strategy seemed to work. There were no sightings, no attacks, no signs of Bass's presence. Hardesty believed the fugitive was holed up somewhere, possibly wounded, definitely running low on supplies. Winter was setting in, cold, rainy weather that made outdoor survival increasingly difficult. Time, Hardesty believed, was now working against Bass. He was wrong. Bass hadn't stopped moving. He had adapted his strategy, recognizing that the systematic pursuit had been replaced by a containment effort. Rather than avoiding detection through wilderness skills alone, he began using the enslaved population's informal communication network, the grapevine telegraph, that transmitted information between plantations through field hands, house servants, and the few free black people who could travel with relative freedom. Through this network, Bass learned about patrol schedules, checkpoint locations, and the identification papers that free black people carried. On December 18th, a free black farmer named Samuel Hayes reported to authorities that his papers had been stolen from his home while he worked his fields. The theft seemed minor, such papers could be replaced, but it represented something more significant. Bass now had documentation that would let him move along roads in daylight, reducing his dependence on wilderness travel. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Miller County gets worse. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On December 22nd, Bass crossed the Sulphur River at a point 10 miles north of Captain Hardesty's picket line. He had spent days watching the patrols, timing their movements, identifying the gap in coverage that existed for approximately 40 minutes each afternoon when shift changes occurred. He traveled as Samuel Hayes, carrying stolen papers and leading a horse he had taken from an isolated farm. Anyone who saw him saw a free black man going about legitimate business. By December 24th, he was 40 miles east of Miller County, well beyond the practical range of pursuit. He had entered territory contested between Confederate and Union forces, where authority was broken up and enforcement inconsistent. The 6 people he had freed from Hutchins plantation were scattered across the region. He had split them up deliberately, knowing that a single large group of fugitives would attract attention, but individuals might slip through. Bass himself continued east, moving toward the Mississippi River and the Union positions beyond. He traveled at night when possible, stayed in free black communities when he could find them, and showed the same patience and calculation that had kept him alive through 2 months of being the most hunted man in Arkansas. On January 7, 1863, he reached Union lines, specifically a camp of the 3rd United States Colored Troops operating in eastern Arkansas. The regiment's records, kept in the National Archives, include an entry from that date noting the arrival of a refugee from slavery who reported the deaths of 14 pursuers during his escape. The commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Thompson, interviewed Bass personally and recorded his impressions. An individual of unusual capability and complete self-control. Shows no remorse for the men he killed, which he describes as necessary military action against combatants attempting his capture. When asked if he felt guilt, he stated, "I feel what any soldier feels after battle. Relief at survival and satisfaction at completing the mission." His mission apparently was to acquire his freedom through force of arms, having concluded that peaceful escape was impossible. The Union Army offered Bass enlistment, which he accepted. He served for the remainder of the war in various roles: scout, intelligence gatherer, and eventually soldier. His military records describe competent service, but note that he rarely spoke about his experiences before reaching Union lines. After the war, he disappeared from historical record, one of millions of freed people who scattered across the nation seeking new lives. But that disappearance wasn't immediate, and the years between 1863 and 1865 revealed dimensions of Bass Reeves that even his flight through Arkansas hadn't fully exposed. The Union Army didn't simply accept escaped slaves into their ranks without careful examination, particularly those who arrived with stories of killing 14 pursuers. Colonel Thompson's initial interview with Bass was followed by 3 more conducted by different officers, each one probing for inconsistencies or signs of exaggeration. What came from those interviews, documented in reports that military historians discovered in the 1970s, was a detailed account that remained consistent across all tellings. Bass described each killing methodically, the location, the circumstances, the tactical considerations that led to his approach. He sketched maps from memory showing where bodies could be found. He listed the weapons he had taken and explained how he had modified some of them for better concealment or efficiency. The officers conducting the interviews reached a unanimous conclusion, stated explicitly in a report dated January 15, 1863, "This individual is neither boastful nor remorseful. He describes acts of lethal violence with the detachment of a craftsman explaining his work. We assess him as highly capable, potentially valuable for irregular operations, and completely reliable within the scope of assigned duties. We also assess him as someone who should never be given reason to consider us enemies." That last observation proved accurate. Bass was assigned to a scout unit operating in contested territory, the fluid zone between Confederate and Union control, where information was currency and survival depended on reading situations quickly. Scout work suited his capabilities perfectly. He moved through landscapes populated by people who looked like him, spoke his language, and had every reason to help Union forces, but also every reason to fear Confederate reprisals. Bass's ability to appear and disappear, to read people and situations, to make decisions without hesitation, all the skills he had developed during his flight translated directly into military effectiveness. His service record includes praise from 3 different commanding officers. One dated July 1863 notes, "Corporal Reeves located and mapped Confederate supply depot coordinates that resulted in successful cavalry raid, entered hostile territory alone, gathered intelligence through observation and conversation with local colored population, returned with actionable information that proved completely accurate." Another from March 1864. Corporal Reeves volunteered for reconnaissance mission considered extremely high risk. Returned with intelligence on troop movements that allowed repositioning of artillery, likely preventing significant casualties in subsequent engagement. But there was another dimension to Bass's wartime service that didn't appear in official records. A dimension that only came out decades later through interviews with other veterans of the United States colored troop. Bass apparently maintained contact with the network of escaped slaves and free black people throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. He used his missions to pass information to plantation slaves about Union positions, safe routes to freedom, and the changing military situation. More significantly, he occasionally undertook unauthorized missions with objectives that had nothing to do with military intelligence and everything to do with settling accounts. A veteran named Isaiah Washington, interviewed in 1903 for a project documenting Black Civil War service, described an incident from autumn 1863. Bass had returned from a reconnaissance mission and learned that a slave catcher named Robert Chenoweth was operating in the area. One of the professional hunters who specialized in pursuing fugitives into Union, controlled territory and returning them to Confederate owners for substantial fees. Chenoweth had a reputation for brutality that exceeded even the standards of his profession. He had apparently been involved in the initial pursuit of Bass back in Miller County, though he had avoided the fate of the 14 men because he had been away on another assignment when Bass made his systematic eliminations. Washington's account describes Bass leaving camp without authorization one evening, carrying only a knife and moving with clear purpose. He returned 3 days later, saying nothing about where he had been. A week after that, word reached the Union camp that Chenoweth had been found dead in his camp, strangled in his sleep, his dogs poisoned, his weapons and papers taken. No one ever officially connected Bass to the killing. But Washington recalled, "We all knew. The way he sat quiet that morning when the news came, cleaning his rifle with hands that never trembled. We knew, and none of us said a word because Chenoweth had dragged more than 60 people back to slavery, and whatever happened to him in the darkness was justice of a kind that courts and laws wouldn't provide." This pattern apparently repeated several times during the war. Men who had participated in slave catching, overseers known for particular cruelty, Confederate officers who had ordered executions of captured black soldiers. They occasionally turned up dead in circumstances that suggested professional execution rather than combat casualties. Military investigators looked into some of these deaths, but in the chaos of war, with casualties mounting and priorities focused elsewhere, a dead slave catcher or brutal overseer didn't warrant extensive investigation. The clearest evidence of Bass's private war came from documents in the Miller County Courthouse discovered during a renovation in 1992. Among old tax records and property deeds, researchers found a journal kept by James Hutchkins, Robert Hutchkins's younger brother, who had managed what remained of the plantation after Robert's injury. The journal covers the years 1863 through. It includes periodic references to the Reeves matter and concerns about security. In an entry dated November 1863, exactly 1 year after Bass's escape, James Hutchkins wrote, "Harold Vickers's brother Thomas arrived today, asking questions about the circumstances of Harold's death. He's heard rumors from soldiers returning from eastern Arkansas. Stories about a colored scout with the Union Army, who matches descriptions of our former property. Thomas believes Harold's killer is not only alive but actively serving our enemies. He wants to pursue the matter, but I've counseled him against it." 14 men pursued Reeves and none returned. Thomas Vickers, whatever his grief, would be a 15th corpse. Some debts must remain uncollected because the cost of collection exceeds any possible benefit. But Thomas Vickers didn't take that advice. Documents from Union Army records show that in January 1864, a civilian was captured near Union lines carrying a loaded rifle and papers identifying him as Thomas Vickers of Miller County, Arkansas. He claimed to be a Confederate sympathizer gathering intelligence, but under questioning, he admitted he was looking for a specific individual, a Union scout named Bass Reeves, whom he believed had killed his brother. The interrogation report, signed by Colonel Thompson himself, describes what happened next. The prisoner was confronted with Corporal Reeves in controlled circumstances. Upon seeing Reeves, the prisoner became agitated and made accusations regarding the death of his brother, Harold Vickers, whom Reeves allegedly killed during escape from slavery. Corporal Reeves confirmed the killing, stating, "Your brother participated in pursuing me with intent to return me to bondage, or kill me in the attempt. I defended myself using means available. If you wish to pursue the same course your brother chose, you'll meet the same end. Otherwise, you have the opportunity he lacked. The opportunity to walk away and live." The prisoner was later transported to a prisoner exchange point and released to Confederate custody. Whether Thomas Vickers took Bass's advice or not remains unknown. His name doesn't appear in later military records, and he's listed in Confederate pension applications after the war, suggesting he survived. But the incident reveals something crucial about Bass's psychology during this period. He wasn't hiding from his past. He owned what he had done completely, without apology or justification beyond the simple logic of self-defense and survival. As the war entered its final year, Bass's reputation within the colored troops had grown to near legendary status. New recruits heard stories about the man who had killed 14 slave catchers during his escape. Veterans who had served with him told different stories about his patience on reconnaissance, his ability to move through hostile territory, his habit of sitting silent through conversations until someone asked him a direct question, at which point he would provide a brief, accurate answer and return to silence. That silence extended to his personal history. Despite serving alongside hundreds of other men who had escaped slavery, Bass never spoke about his life before November 1862. Other soldiers shared stories of families left behind, of owners they had served, of the routes they had taken to freedom. Bass offered nothing. When directly asked, he would deflect with variations of, "That life ended when I took the chains off Hutchkins's wagon. What matters is what comes next." What came next as the war ended in April 1865 was a choice faced by 4 million newly freed people: where to go, what to do, how to build lives in a nation that had defined them as property for 2.5 centuries. For many veterans of the colored troops, the choice involved staying near where they had served, taking advantage of land opportunities or military connections. For Bass, the choice apparently involved complete separation from his past. The last definitive military record of Bass Reeves is dated June 18, 1865, a discharge certificate noting completion of service and providing basic physical description. Bass Reeves, colored, age approximately 35 years, height 6 feet 2 inches, identifying marks including scars on back consistent with whipping. Served with distinction in 3rd United States Colored Troops from January 1863 through June 1865. Commended for reconnaissance work and intelligence gathering. Authorized for veterans' pension upon reaching appropriate age. After that date, the historical record becomes broken up, scattered mentions in documents that may or may not refer to the same individual. A.B. Reeves appears in an 1867 Memphis City directory listed as a blacksmith. A Bass Reeves is mentioned in an 1870 newspaper from Fort Smith, Arkansas, describing a dispute over property rights. Another Bass Reeves shows up in 1875 Oklahoma Territory records as a Deputy U.S. Marshal, though some historians dispute whether this is the same person who escaped from Miller County 12 years earlier. What's documented beyond dispute are the effects of his story through the communities most affected by it. In Miller County, the white population dealt with the Bass Reeves incident through collective forgetting. The 14 dead men were rarely mentioned. The circumstances of their deaths were simplified or hidden. Family members who knew the truth kept it private, sharing it only in guarded conversations, with those who would understand the shame of having lost fathers or brothers to someone they had been taught to consider naturally inferior. But the formerly enslaved population throughout Arkansas and surrounding states preserved every detail. The story was told and retold, often embellished, but keeping its essential core. One man had refused to accept bondage, had fought with systematic efficiency, had killed everyone sent to recapture him, and had walked away to freedom. In churches and family gatherings, in the quiet moments when elders spoke to youth, the story served multiple purposes. It was inspiration, proof that resistance was possible. It was warning freedom came with terrible costs. And it was proof of a truth that slavery's defenders had desperately tried to suppress. That intelligence, capability, and deadly competence existed independent of skin color or social status. The psychological impact on those who had known Bass personally was particularly deep. Otto Brenner, the German blacksmith who had worked alongside Bass at Hutchins' plantation, gave an interview to a Memphis newspaper in 1871. In it, he reflected on the 6 years he had spent teaching Bass advanced blacksmithing techniques. "I believed I was training a valuable worker. I didn't understand I was arming a weapon. Every skill I taught him: how to analyze a lock's mechanism, how to assess metal strength, how to use leverage for maximum force. He absorbed and cataloged for future use. When I learned what he had done after escaping, my first reaction was horror. My second was professional admiration. He had taken theoretical knowledge and applied it with practical genius under conditions that would have broken most men. My third reaction, which haunts me still, is recognition that if I had been in his position, subjected to what he had endured, I would have done exactly the same things, or tried to, though I doubt I would have survived as he did." The documents that tell Bass Reeves's complete story are scattered across dozens of archives, courthouse basements, and private collections. Assembling them requires the kind of patient, systematic work that Bass himself demonstrated during his escape. Gathering individual pieces, analyzing how they fit together, recognizing patterns that reveal larger truths. The effort is complicated by deliberate hiding. Officials in Miller County and surrounding areas apparently made conscious decisions to minimize documentation of the incident, recognizing that detailed records would serve as permanent evidence of their failure to recapture one escaped slave despite devoting extraordinary resources to the pursuit. But absence of documentation tells its own story. The Miller County Sheriff's records for November and December 1862 show an unusual gap. Routine reports resume in January 1863 without any explanation for the missing weeks. The county commissioners' meeting minutes from that period mention expenses related to a fugitive recovery, but provide no details about the fugitive, the recovery efforts, or the outcomes. Tax records show 14 death certificates filed between November and December 1862, but the causes of death are listed generically as misadventure, accident, or simply deceased. The families of the dead men, however, kept their own records. Estate settlements, property transfers, and pension applications documented in state archives reveal the human cost of the pursuit. Douglas Patterson, the first man killed, left a wife and 3 children who lost their farm within 2 years of his death, unable to maintain it without his labor. William Taggart's widow filed for a Confederate pension in 1868, claiming hardship based on her husband's death in service to the state. The application was denied because Taggart hadn't been formally enlisted in military service. Slave catching, however dangerous, didn't qualify for veteran benefits. The collective economic impact on Miller County was substantial. 14 men represented a significant portion of the county's law enforcement and labor management capacity. Their deaths, combined with the disruption caused by Bass's attack on Hutchins' plantation, contributed to a breakdown in plantation discipline that accelerated as Union forces gained control of Arkansas. Enslaved people who had heard about Bass's successful escape and violent resistance began their own escape attempts. Some succeeded. Others were caught and subjected to punishments that grew increasingly severe as owners tried desperately to maintain control over property that understood it would soon be freed. Robert Hutchins never fully recovered from the trauma of Bass's attack. Medical records from a Memphis physician, kept in that city's medical archives, described treating Hutchins in 1864 for symptoms that included persistent headaches, memory problems, and paranoid anxiety. The physician's notes describe a man convinced that his former property will return to complete the work started with the chain strike. Patient maintains loaded weapons at all times, starts at sudden sounds, and reports difficulty sleeping. Physical examination shows healed skull fracture with possible permanent damage to brain tissue. Psychological condition appears rooted in assault trauma, combined with recognition that social order he had assumed permanent is collapsing around him. Hutchins sold his plantation in March 1865, taking a substantial loss because buyers recognized that slave-based agriculture was ending. He moved to Texas, purchased a small farm, and died in 1869 according to his death certificate from complications of old head injury. His obituary in the Tyler, Texas newspaper made no mention of how he had received that injury, describing him simply as a former Arkansas planter who relocated after the recent unpleasantness. The Hutchins plantation property itself underwent transformation that reflected the broader changes sweeping through the South. During Reconstruction, portions were sold to formerly enslaved people through programs designed to redistribute land. By 1870, the 4,000-acre plantation had been divided into 37 small farms, most operated by black families. The plantation house was purchased by a northern teacher who had come south to establish a school for freed people. The slave quarters were torn down, their materials reused to build new structures, and the punishment house, that building where Bass had freed 2 people during his midnight raid, was burned in a ceremony that descendants of those involved described as necessary cleansing of cursed ground. A physical evidence of Bass's journey through Arkansas occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways. In 1873, a farmer clearing land near the Sulphur River discovered a cache of weapons buried in a hollow tree, 3 rifles, 2 pistols, ammunition, and a knife, all wrapped in oiled cloth. The weapons matched descriptions of those taken from the men Bass killed, suggesting he had hidden them as he moved toward Union lines, unable to carry everything but unwilling to leave them where they might be found and used against others seeking freedom. In 1889, construction workers excavating for a new courthouse in Texarkana unearthed what appeared to be a prepared campsite. A depression in the ground covered with cut branches positioned to provide concealment, while offering views of the surrounding area. Among the remnants were fragments of leather that might have been from shoes or bags, fire-hardened stones that could have been used for cooking, and metal fragments that might have been tools. Local historians speculated this might have been one of Bass's hiding places during his flight, though conclusive proof was impossible. The most significant discovery occurred in 1938 when a descendant of Otto Brenner donated his ancestors' papers to the Arkansas State Historical Society. Among them was a letter Brenner had written but apparently never sent, dated December 1862. In it he reflected on Bass's escape and the subsequent killings. "I am troubled by what Bass has done, yet I cannot condemn him. For 6 years I worked alongside him, teaching him skills while remaining ignorant of the man I was teaching. He never complained, never showed anger, never gave any indication of the calculations proceeding behind his eyes. Now I understand that silence was survival strategy. Any word, any expression, any moment of inattention could have triggered the kind of attention that made life unbearable. So he presented a mask of compliance while observing everything, learning everything, preparing for an opportunity that required only moments of violent action to initiate. The men he killed believed they were pursuing property. They died learning they were hunting a human being who decided life as property wasn't life at all, that death was preferable to continued bondage, and that anyone participating in his recapture was an enemy to be eliminated without hesitation or mercy. We condemn him for this. But what else could he do? Submit peacefully to recapture, return docilely to chains, beg for mercy from men who had built their livelihoods on denying mercy to people who looked like him. I think of the locks I taught him to analyze, the mechanisms I showed him how to disassemble, the principles of leverage and force I explained without understanding how he would apply them. I armed him intellectually and didn't realize it. But someone else armed him morally. Every overseer who had struck him, every owner who had sold him, every slave catcher who had pursued others, every element of the system that treated human beings as livestock. They created something they couldn't control and paid the price for that creation. History will judge Bass Reeves harshly, I suspect. He killed 14 men, most of them with families who grieve their loss. But I wonder if history will judge honestly, if it will acknowledge that those 14 chose to participate in an economic system based on violent subjugation, that they pursued Bass knowing capture meant his return to conditions we wouldn't impose on animals, that they accepted the premise that some human beings exist as property for others to exploit. Bass rejected that premise with violence, yes. But what is slavery itself, if not violence made institutional, made respectable through law and custom? I am a simple craftsman, not a philosopher. But I know this: the man I taught blacksmithing possessed intelligence and capability equal to anyone I've known, regardless of color. The system that claimed to own him was based on a lie, that such capabilities didn't exist in people of African descent, that slavery was natural order rather than enforced brutality. Bass destroyed that lie through his actions. 14 men died learning that slaves could think, plan, and execute complex strategies. Thousands more learned it watching his escape, and millions will eventually learn it as this war destroys the institution built on that foundational lie. I am troubled, but I am not surprised. The surprise would have been if someone with Bass's capabilities had remained docile under conditions designed to break the spirit of lesser men. He broke free instead, and I suspect future generations will debate whether he was criminal or freedom fighter, murderer or soldier, monster or hero. I know only that he was human, fully human, and humans confronted with his circumstances will do extraordinary things to survive. A Brenner's letter never reached its intended recipient, his brother in Pennsylvania. But its preservation provides insight into how at least one white Southerner processed the mental conflict of recognizing capability and humanity in someone the system defined as property. The question of what happened to Bass after June 1865 has never been definitively answered. The various Bass Reeves who appear in historical records might be the same person living under his chosen name, or different people who happen to share it. The lack of photographs from the Civil War period makes visual confirmation impossible. The absence of detailed physical descriptions beyond height and scars means any reasonably tall black man with whipping scars might have been the Bass Reeves who escaped from Miller County. Some researchers believe Bass deliberately obscured his post-war life, recognizing that his reputation as a killer might attract unwanted attention or revenge attempts. Others suggest he simply disappeared into the anonymity that 4 million freed people enjoyed. No longer property requiring documentation, just one more person trying to build a life in a transformed nation. The most intriguing possibility involves the Deputy U.S. Marshal named Bass Reeves who served in Oklahoma Territory from the 1870s through the early 20th century. This Bass Reeves was a legend in his own right, a lawman who reportedly brought in more than 3,000 fugitives, killed 14 men in the line of duty, and built a reputation as one of the most skilled marshals on the frontier. His mastery of tracking, tactics, and wilderness survival set him apart. But it was the number that caught historians' attention of 14. 14 men killed in self-defense during his years as a marshal. 14 men killed in pursuit during an escape from slavery. The coincidence has fueled a century of speculation that the Reaper of Miller County and Marshal Bass Reeves might have been the same man. The parallels are undeniable. The skills that defined an exceptional lawman, the ability to move unseen, to read terrain, to anticipate danger, to make split-second judgments, are the very traits required to survive an escape through hostile territory. And the mindset of someone who had once faced death rather than return to bondage could easily transform into the resolve of a man enforcing the law on a violent frontier. Yet the historical record remained silent. The Bass Reeves who wore the badge claimed Arkansas as his birthplace and said he had been freed during the war, but he offered no details about his enslaved life, no mention of military service. When questioned about his past, he deflected with quiet finality. "What I did before I took the badge," he once said, "who'sn't relevant to the work I do now. Judge me by what I am, not what I was." Whether or not they were the same person, both men, the escaped slave and the frontier lawman, stood as living proof that intelligence, courage, and discipline existed entirely independent of the social hierarchies that slavery tried to impose. Both defied the racist logic that equated color with capacity. Both demonstrated what could happen when necessity and opportunity met in a single, determined mind. The legacy of the Miller County incident stretched far beyond one man's story. Across the post-war South, newly freed people told their children and grandchildren about Bass Reeves, sometimes using his real name, sometimes calling him the blacksmith, sometimes simply the man who killed 14 and walked away free. His story became a counterweight to humiliation, a whispered anthem of resistance. It reminded those still oppressed that the master class was not untouchable, that one person's will could shatter the illusion of control. For white Southerners, especially in Arkansas, the tale carried a different warning, that every system built on domination breeds its own destruction, that to deny humanity is to provoke it, and that underestimating those you oppress can be fatal. The 14 men who rode into the wilderness made their choice to defend a system that turned human beings into property. They died not because of chance, but because they believed superiority was skin deep. They entered a contest of endurance and intellect against someone who had spent 6 years preparing for it, and they lost. Whoever Bass Reeves truly was, his story could not be erased. Documents scattered in forgotten archives, family papers sealed in attics, and oral histories passed down through generations all preserve fragments of what happened. One man refused bondage so completely that 14 pursuers never returned, and the institution of slavery in Miller County never recovered from that lesson. This mystery endures because it exposes more than a man's identity. It reveals the violence at slavery's core, the brilliance it tried to suppress, and the price exacted when injustice is allowed to rule unchecked. It reminds us that history's silences are often intentional, that what is missing from the record may speak louder than what remains, and that some debts written in blood and silence are eventually paid. So, what do you believe? Was everything truly uncovered? Or do secrets still lie buried in courthouse basements, in family letters never shown, in stories too dangerous to tell aloud? If this tale gripped you, subscribe for more hidden histories. Stories that blur the line between horror and truth and force us to confront what humanity is capable of, both in cruelty and in resistance.